Ted Cruz having a rough time in New York in the Bronx. He got the Bronx cheer, protesters yelling at him outside a restaurant. Then his scheduled trip to a charter school canceled after students protested and threatened to walk out of school. Now, perhaps Daily News said it best with its front cover today. You can read it yourself. I would say it's self-explanatory. Now, New Yorkers, they got long memories, and they're not going to forget the Texas senator criticizing New York values or voting against funding for Hurricane Sandy, 9/11 first responders, the Zadroga Act. All that adding up to Cruz polling third in New York, and this is just 12 days before primary day. Trump, he's holding a commanding lead in his home state, but is the Donald giving agita to Republicans from his home state? Well, let's ask one of them. Congressman Chris Gibson, Republican from New York. He's Army veteran who rose to the rank of colonel and was deployed 7 times, including 4 combat tours in Iraq. And I want to talk about a bunch of things from your own political future to what's going on in New York. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Richard. Thanks.
Absolutely. So first off, and you don't have to name names here. I know you haven't endorsed anybody. A couple of Republicans in the New York delegation have endorsed Trump. Peter King, we've talked to the congressman. He's had agita over this thing already. He said as much. How difficult is it for New Yorkers because of the down-ticket considerations for guys running a re-election in November, and also one guy who certainly hasn't made any friends in New York with what he said, and another person who's such a polarizing figure? It could complicate their chances if he's on the top of the ticket. Obviously, I'm talking about Cruz, and I'm talking about Trump.
Well, it's a big year, and we need to win the White House. We need to hold control of Congress. And you just mentioned Ted Cruz. You mentioned Zadroga. He voted against it. The Sandy aid, he voted against it. He also voted against the military in terms of the National Security Policy Bill. And then, of course, the comments he said about New York. I'm not a fan. And then, quite candidly, I'm not endorsing any of the 3 at this point. And I mentioned right at the outset how important it is we win this year, so you can imagine how underwhelmed and disappointed I am at this point. I do want to say this. I understand why voters are moving to Trump. I understand not only that, I share some of the reasons why they're upset. You look at, let's review the bidding here, 2008, the big banks. We had the bank bailout, right? I think we should have went in a different direction, and I was asked about this when I retired from the Army and ran. I said we shouldn't have bailed out the banks. What we should have done is moved in another direction, tried to protect investors, FDIC, and some other vehicles. And then, we had a lot of people certainly very upset about the war. I spent 4 tours in Iraq myself. I believe in peace through strength, the Reagan approach to defense. And so, not only that war, but also individuals, the president wanted to bomb Libya, and then others that wanted to bomb Syria. So a lot of people very upset that it looks like all war all the time. So big banks, big war. The third is education. People even this week very upset about the testing, the onerous high-stakes testing. So big war, big banks, big testing, big education, and then finally big trade. You had NAFTA that had adverse impacts across the Northeast, including New York. Now some want to foist this Trans-Pacific Partnership. I oppose it. So on all 4 of those issues, I'm on the right side of the people who are very upset.
Well, let me ask you on the military side. Certainly you're informed. The idea of Donald Trump having access to the launch codes and he's not the only one. Cruz talked about carpet bombing and all the rest. For these guys, it's just sound bites. For you, it's your life. How troubling is it, especially in this day and age, with how volatile the Middle East is right now, that to be commander-in-chief, and I'll use my words, being as reckless as they are with some of this dialogue?
Well, look, I am concerned, but candidly, I'm more concerned about the candidates on the other side. So, again, not in a particularly great spot right now. I mentioned those 4 issues why people are moving to Trump. The 5th would be about leadership. And as much as I thought John Boehner was a good and honorable man, I did not vote for his reelect either. So, those that are moving to Donald Trump, I not only understand why they're upset, I share their concern. I haven't said that. I don't think that Donald Trump is the right leader for this time. You mentioned the military. I want to see somebody who will study, will really take the job very seriously and do the work. And to date, I have not seen this. He was asked about he did not know the difference between the F-22 and the F-35. He confused the Quds Force and the Kurds, and that's like essential to the whole region, Middle East region. And he was asked about the triad, and it seemed to go right over his head. I mentioned Ted Cruz. He voted against the national security of our country. And Kasich, people say, well, why don't you support him? Here's a guy that full-throated supported Common Core. He supports the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He seems more like a neoconservative, which, you know, when you say neoconservative, that's not conservative. I mean, this is the all war, all time. Not that everyone who ascribes to neoconservatism has that point of view, but I'm for peace through strength, the Reagan approach.
And again, you're not running for re-election, so you don't have to deal with this, but do you expect a full food fight, floor fight in Cleveland?
Well, anybody who looks at the math right now, anyone, rationally looks at the math, it looks like it is going to come down to multiple ballots in Cleveland. By the way, it's not utterly out of the question that that isn't the same case for the Democrats. We'll have to see.
Not as likely. Not as
likely because of the superdelegates, but still possible.
Labels this election year, obviously, in both parties, carry different connotations. But I'm curious. Off your voting record, you were termed the most moderate member of the Republican Party in Congress. Do you view that as something you have to explain to voters, or that you embrace the idea that, for some, especially in your party, the idea of compromising is the equivalent to capitulation? How do you view that?
Well, evidently doing fine, because, you know, in the last election, I serve in a district that is, the analysts in D.C. describe it as a Democratic-leaning district. My congressional district voted for President Obama twice, almost by 7 points in 2012, and I was outspent over 2-1, and we won by 30 points. So evidently, I not only get my entire base, my Republican conservative base, but I win an overwhelming majority of independents and a fair number of Democrats. This was documented by the New York Times in their coverage. I'm a Reagan Republican. You know, this day and age, how would Reagan do? Well, there's been a lot of discussion about that. But if you take a look at what I'm for, growing the economy so that everyone gets a chance, getting back to a balanced budget, protecting this exceptional way of life. I was the first Republican ever in my family. They were Irish Catholic, all Democrats. As a teenager, watching my dad go through, he was out of work most of the late 70s. I was in the space to be influenced by Ronald Reagan. When he came, he seemed to always be positive. He had a message of growth. We had hostages in Iran. He had a way of dealing with that. And so, you know, he had a fundamental imprint on my life.
You mentioned it yourself. Reagan today probably wouldn't have gotten through this primary process. So I'm curious, widely rumored, and you've done nothing to tamp down the implications that you're probably going to be running for governor in New York.
I've got an exploratory committee. And
I love these exploratory
committees. Well, I'll tell you what, we're raising money. We got over 1,000 volunteers. Check out GibsonForNewYork.com, GibsonForNewYork.com. Go to there. Go to that website, learn more about my background and how I want to help change the state.
Believe me, I tell all the guys that work for the Astorino folks, don't sleep on you. So to that end, I'm curious. Let's say you want to be governor. Let's play along with my hypothetical. Is it more about wanting to be governor or also saying, get me out of Washington? I mean, you're going to work every day, honestly. I'm not saying it's because you're here. You're an accomplished guy. You've actually not just talked about it, but served your country. You could do other things. Is there a certain point where you say, why am I banging my head against the wall? Nobody wants to get anything done around here. I might as well go back home and try and do something. Believe me, Albany's no day in the park here, but is it as much getting out of D.C. as wanting to do something different?
Not at all, Richard. In fact, it was a great privilege. This is my final year, and I would tell you, not widely reported, in the last year, we got some very important legislation enacted, not talked about, not proposed, but enacted. You know, when you talk about national security, very important. We got our servicemen and women the resources that they needed, along with a pay raise. Important veterans legislation, 9.8% increase in the VA. An important mental health bill. That was the Clay Hunt Suicide Awareness and Prevention Bill. You mentioned earlier the Zadroga bill, which are veterans, domestic veterans here, our firefighters, and all of our first responders, our policemen and women, EMS. Important legislation signed into law. We rolled back at the federal level, No Child Left Behind, which was the father of Common Core. Now, we have more work to do here in the state because that's really where the loci of power is, and I'm calling on the governor to roll back Common Core. He's failed us to date. He's 3 times now he's tried to reboot, and we got a very important infrastructure bill done. You know, that's a 10% increase paid for, 10% increase for New York that helps with our roads and bridges, water and sewer. So, you know, we have focused, even though it hasn't received a lot of media attention, on delivering for our people, all the while cutting the deficit by 75%. We're within arm's length of a balanced budget. We need to work to get there. And when we do, we need to stay there. So it's not about, you know, it's been a privilege to serve. I always self-impose term limits. I don't believe in career politicians. I think our founders meant to have us be a self-governing people. You go for a period of time, and then you come back. And that's exactly what I'm doing. As far as the governor's race, you know, I feel a calling to do this because, as you point out, it's like the last thing I need, quite candidly, in my life. You know, I was an infantryman, but 3 of my years in the Army, I taught at West Point. It was a great privilege to serve there. And while I was in academia, I was self-actualized. A year I was at the War College out at Stanford. I wrote a book, Securing the State, on national security decision-making. So the pull to go to academia was real. But I'll tell you, Richard, you know, ultimately this is a calling because I believe I can win. And I believe I can change the state.
Let me ask you a question, because we'll talk much more, assuming you follow through on what looks to be the path on the policy front. But the math says you got a guy who ran the last time, who's already announced he's going to run again, who's got the name recognition from the last go-round, and you've got a governor in a blue state here with 2-to-1 registration almost. Give me the path that somebody can A, get through a primary against a known commodity, and B, be the seating governor, assuming he runs for re-election, in a blue state.
Well, first of all, Rob Astorino is not my opponent. He's my friend. And he's going to run for re-election in Westchester.
I haven't heard that one in politics before, but that's good.
Well, I mean, I've supported him.
Yeah.
I fought really hard for him in the last race, and I understand he's going to run for re-elect in Westchester. I'm going to support him. My opponent's going to be Cuomo. And, you know, you take a look, it's a 2-to-1 Democratic state, and he's likely to raise and spend over $50 million. But we can win. I just showed that in my last congressional race. Outspent over 2-to-1 in a Democratic district, won by 30 percentage points. I think you have to start early. That's really key. Because what Governor Cuomo relies upon is basically filling all your airwaves with negative ads, and people say, well, I don't want to vote for that guy. But if you start early and you work hard and get to know people and you raise money early, then you can actually show the how you really are.
I'm up on the break. When do you figure you have to announce by or decide by?
Well, I'm going to finish strong as a representative in Congress, and then at the end of the term, at the end of this year, look for early next year.
We will be looking.
Thank you, Richard.
Congressman, thank you so
Good to be
much.
with you.
Absolutely. All right, coming up next, everybody, we'll bring the guys back out here. We've told you about Republicans who are trying to deny Trump the nomination. So how do Trump supporters feel about that? Well, Dom went to the Trump rally last night on the island and asked him that very question. We'll get to that after this.